Morning, folks. Let me get some of my decaf. All right. Viewer question. I think it was Isaiah, but it's not spelt like you think it is. Um, I think he asked me, do I think there's such a thing as spontaneous fighting ability? Um, I mean, yeah, of course. Not only that, I think it's something everyone potentially has. The degree of it will vary, but I also think it's something that can be trained by not being spontaneous. All right, so what the heck does that mean? Um, I'm gonna, before I even start to explain what I'm trying to say, I'm gonna say that all of this is heavily influenced by the teachings of the American Karate Institute growing up in Hamilton, New Jersey. And my number one main teacher there was Rick Hahn, who was such an inspiration to me in this. And also there was Blaine Elmer taught there sometimes. One other cat whose name I can't remember. Bob Diddock. And also briefly Rich Bracconi. But let's give credit to Dennis Dwyer, who's the originator of that system. It's called the Way of the Sphere, which, if you look at it, it is unlike any karate system you've seen. It has many similarities to most Kung Fu systems in that it is circular, fluid, continuous. In Chinese Kung Fu, you would use the system Lian Huan Kun, continuous and returning fist, to describe it. Its influences are many, and the backstory is sometimes fishy. They tell me the backstory, and I don't know if I believe all of it, but it was just an amazing experience training there. And while I think I got a couple stripes on the orange belt, which in some schools that would be like getting your black belt or like a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It takes time. They were big on spontaneity and fluidity. They believed in what's called expressions rather than techniques. You have an individual technique, a reverse punch, a front kick, a roundhouse kick, right? But when you start putting things together, you begin to flow and you begin to create and spontaneously do things. So you develop that spontaneity by not being spontaneous, by drilling things regularly. For example, I'll give you any example, but here's a very common technique and a very practical technique. I'm here, I parry a punch, right? Or I cover against a hook punch. Very common. So if I'm a coach that has a training method and I don't stress spontaneity much, what I'll do is I'll have you practice, here's a parry and a punch. Here's a parry, and I'll come back with a back fist and throw a roundhouse kick, right? And I'll have you practice that combination. And combination 2 will be, here's a parry, and I'm going to throw a hook punch and come back with an uppercut. I'll do a parry, and maybe I'll front kick and roundhouse kick this way. So I'll have you practice that parry against a certain type of punch, or maybe a range of punches. But I'm teaching you material, and then I expect you to work it on the equipment, and then I expect you to spar with it. So at some point, hopefully you'll start using it spontaneously. You won't have to think about it. Most martial arts are at that point, but to be honest with you, that is actually not very spontaneous, because to be completely spontaneous and in the moment, you have to, in a pressure situation, you have to learn to be spontaneous and in the moment in training situations, and the more you do it, the more spontaneous you will be. Now, there is a weakness to this. If the stuff you train is inefficient or insufficient, you'll spontaneously execute inefficient or insufficient things. But pressure has a way of correcting you, right? Even if you're a like, say you're well trained in a system that's just not that practical and has a bunch of moves, or maybe the moves can be practical. Most martial arts systems have similar basic constituents, but you've never learned how to practically use it, right? If you actually start sparring, or if you actually start getting in fights, at some point your body and your mind, through receiving pain and feedback, will probably find a way to make something work. You follow me so far? Maybe not. I mean, this is a tough concept. So for example, one way to train is, and we would do this at the American Karate Institute, but we would do it, for example, with an inward, they would call it an inward strike, not an inward block, but they kind of taught it as a block. Someone does a step through punch and I block. And I do a punch to the body and then a punch to the head, and then you do something called a recovery, where you get behind the person, place a hand on their shoulder. So you're in their blind spot after every technique. And then another expression was someone comes at you and you do a low side kick and then do the block and get behind them and do the same combination. And that was your introductory level. But, after a while, practicing in the air and with partners, you were told, make it an expression of you. So you might start off with this inward block, and then be told, just do any 3 techniques that come to mind and at speed. And then you would do it, with a partner, and then you would start flowing. And then, after you learned a certain amount of opening moves, then you would maybe modify. I would like to modify my opening move to a parry, and then move on to something else. You'd start expressing these moves and make them uniquely yours. And we would do an exercise where the teacher, you'd be in your fighting stance and you're facing the front of the class, and you would be given the injunction that every time the teacher counted, you had to do an expression and make sure that you had 5 moves. And sometimes it was up to 10. And you're just flowing and trying to breathe. And as you're doing this, you're learning how to do breath control. You're learning how to target different things. And I came to that school, I already had a vocabulary of movement. So, that my influence from Shotokan started to show. And I was also learning Goju Dao Te at the time. And, they had I had learned a lot of hand techniques from that, and from books and magazines and watching movies. And I would experiment with things, and unlike every other martial arts school I've been in, I was more or less allowed to roll, as long as it, looked like it fit within the principles of the system. And that approach stayed with me. I'm like, what weakness I found in the style was that its basis was very traditional Okinawan/Korean technical basis. And this was in the 80s, when almost everybody still trained this as a block, or this as a block, or this as a block, or this as a block. And so the deeper bunkais of Asian martial arts, at least on the level I was being taught there, maybe when you got deeper they got into Tuote Kyushu. I don't know. I didn't get that far. But most karate schools, Tang Sudo schools, Taekwondo schools, and Kung Fu schools taught a very surface level understanding of application, and much of it was inefficient. For example, this block is supposed to be stopping a kind of a hooking or straight type punch. It is physically impossible. There's nobody that actually wants to hurt you on the face of the earth will throw a punch that slow and that inept, like a step through punch, to be blocked by this, and the angle's wrong. If you actually block here, the hook punch is going to go through. If you go out, you might as well cover, right? And this inward block requires you to sort of wind up and then block inward. It's never going to work. These are actually strikes, like a hammer fist to the temple. And this, for example, is fantastic if you hit the throat and step forward 45 degrees. You can severely injure someone, right? These are fantastic for grip fighting, getting someone off you, or even hammering down on a vital point, like the groin or the kidneys. So if you're if you're training spontaneity all the time, but your stuff isn't well thought out, your understanding of your techniques are not well thought out, you'll spontaneously do stuff that isn't that efficient. And that was my problem with the training there. I'd been there over a year, maybe 2 years, and it was just fun training that way. You felt so good, and as a teenager, it's one of the few places where I could just express myself without any censure. But there you didn't spar there till maybe you hit green belt, which was halfway through the system, or even red belt, and it took about 6 years or so to get that black belt in that current iteration of the school. So, meanwhile, in Goju Dao Te, I had gotten my brown belt. Okay, I was training long enough to get a brown belt. I started training both systems at almost the same time. And in Goju Dao Te, I was a brown belt. And in Way of the Sphere, I was an orange belt, like 2 or 3 stripes, something like that, a couple stripes. And I know there were 3 stripes, and then you got your green belt, but that could take 4 years, 5 years, right? So, and I was sparring all the time in Goju Dao Te, and I was sparring other kids at school and outside of school. I was sparring boxers, and there'd be the occasional altercation. This was the 80s, and I would use the spontaneity of the Way of the Sphere, but not the techniques, and not the combos and the flow. I'd have to, adapt that to my other techniques. And again, in that system, orange belt is nothing. Spending 2 years is nothing. It's kind of like Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, where it takes a long time to get a black belt. And I guess it's also similar to Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in that if you're in the context that they set, if you fight in the octagon or in the Gracie Challenge, and you've got those padded surfaces, and it's only one-on-one, and there's no weapons, and there's you leave out groin grabbing and eye gouging and things like that. It works fantastic. It's supreme in its element, but taken outside of its element, it's a different story, right? And so I decided, I'm dividing my attention between these two things, and it's starting to piss off my instructors. And I had to make a choice, I was like, if I get my black belt in Goju Dao Te, then I can open my own class at some point, start teaching, start sparring a wider variety of people. It opened up all these opportunities, and it just seemed like, what I was learning at the other place was an evolutionary dead end. Now, this video has stretched on really long, and what I'm going to do is make this a multi-part series, okay? Because what happened after that, and throughout my life, there have been incidences where spontaneously things began to happen, and I began to understand it.